This is episode 16 of the Women in Depth podcast. The information found in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Today, our topic is an experience that I'm guessing all of us experience at least once in our lifetime, and that is the experience of heartbreak when a relationship ends. My guest today is Stephanie Macadaan, a marriage and family therapist in Los Angeles, California, who specializes in couples therapy and working with those starting over after a relationship ends. Stephanie is going to talk about why the experience of heartbreak is so difficult to move through, the different stages of healing after heartbreak, and the myths and misperceptions surrounding heartbreak. I feel that everyone can benefit from Stephanie's insights regardless of gender. So let's go ahead and jump into the interview. Hi, and welcome to the podcast. Today our guest is Stephanie Macadaan. Stephanie is a licensed marriage and family therapist practicing in Los Angeles, California. She specializes in working with couples and also works with men and women healing from a breakup. She also runs a support group called Happily Ever After Divorce, Healing Support for Women. Hi, Stephanie, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I'm so glad that you're here to talk about an experience that I believe everyone has at several points in their life, whether it's a divorce or it's a breakup. And so really this topic is something that is meaningful to everyone, men, women. I can't imagine that a person goes through their life without experiencing some sort of heartbreak at some point.
Right. It's a pretty universal experience that most people do go through.
Yeah. So Stephanie, can you start off with sharing a little bit more about yourself with our listeners?
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, I work in Los Angeles and really was interested in working with couples because I feel like such a great way to work on ourselves. But more and more this path of working with people that have recently gotten out of relationships and are really struggling came to me. And I have experience with that myself, as many of us do. And it just really became a mission of mine almost to guide people through it and show them that there's actually a lot of potential and growth that can happen through these struggles. So I really started doing a lot of work with that.
Yeah, and I think that, what you were saying about the potential in such a painful experience that's so important, but yet so hard to see when you're in the midst of that emotional pain.
It really is. When you're just struggling and suffering and oftentimes dealing with symptoms of depression or anxiety and everything feels chaotic, it's so hard to imagine that there could be something good that could come out of this and a time that you're not going to feel all of these really strong, difficult emotions. So the support is really needed.
You've described some of the feelings that can come with heartbreak or the ending of a relationship. What are some of the other ways that this emotional pain or heartbreak can be experienced or manifested?
Well, what I find, most people in the middle of heartbreak go through, there's a few different kind of universal challenges around that. One is the difficulty of having conflicting emotions. When we first go through a breakup, we kind of love and miss our ex one second and then hate and feel so angry at them the next. And that's difficult to kind of tolerate for yourself and swing between the two. And then another big one is really shame and embarrassment. Somehow in our society, it's kind of been looked at as a negative thing to be single, or that if you're not in a relationship, you're somehow not as good as others that are. So really working through kind of that heavy emotion of shame, that's such a difficult one to really deal with when you're in the middle of it. And then another big one is really uncertainty because, we have kind of built this sort of feeling of security in our relationship, and to have that gone, we're sort of stranded in the middle of a desert. Like, where do I go next? What's going to happen? Am I ever going to be happy again? Will it be okay? So that uncertainty is another real challenge.
When you break it down into those three areas, I just think of it as, it's a really painful, difficult time. But when you break it down like that, you can see why. I mean, that's a lot. Any one of those things by themselves would be a lot to deal with. So multi-layered. And I think you throw in other things, just the practicalities sometimes of a breakup and throw that in as far as, what does this look like? Are we moving out of a home
Yeah.
that you've been in for a very long time, a neighborhood. If you belong to a sense of, a lot of times your relationship belongs to another community, so plays in the areas that you've described.
That's right. Yeah. Kind of what I was talking about was the emotional experience, but you're right. There's so much on top of that emotional experience out with other relationships, just all kinds of things. So
yeah, so much.
It's a tricky time.
That internal stuff and then the external, all of it. No wonder someone would be experiencing depression or anxiety or any of those emotions. I know that when I've clients in my office who are in the midst of this, a lot of times they'll actually say, I feel like I'm losing my mind. I feel like I'm going crazy and loss of control,
Yes, that feeling of out of control and kind of lost. And it is a really scary feeling to have. And it takes time. That's the hard part, is it just takes time and a lot of work to get moved through it in a healthy way. I always say, I wish I had a magic wand, but unfortunately, that hasn't been invented yet.
Yeah. Stephanie, since the main audience for our podcast are women, are there any unique challenges to breakup that women face?
Well, for women, I think it's especially the idea that if I'm not in a relationship, then I'm not as valuable or I'm not desirable or there's something wrong with me. That seems to be especially hard for women to deal with. And then I think also kind of the overwhelm of starting brand new with someone else. And so many that I work with are convinced they'll never find someone again like they had, or they won't be able to have another relationship like that. So I think it kind of comes back to that sort of sense of self and learning more who you are outside of a relationship in order to get into a healthy one.
And so really working on their relationship with themselves.
Yeah, exactly. I think sometimes that gets lost. More often than not, I think that gets lost.
Yeah.
And so finding that again can be very empowering and can really build a lot of strength.
What you just shared, Stephanie, made me think of a quote from one of my mentors, Dr. James Hollis, who's a Jungian analyst. And he said that the quality of our relationships is in direct proportion to the quality of the relationship we have with ourselves. And so it came to mind when you were speaking right now.
I love that. And it really is so true. It's our internal world is reflected externally on what's happening to us. And most people think it's the opposite, that externally what's happening to us is creating all these feelings. But we have a lot more power over that than most realize.
It's a tough shift, though, isn't it? Going that shift from external to internal?
It is. It is. I always say it's kind of like learning Latin when you've been speaking English forever. It's sort of a whole new way of viewing situations and thinking about them and yourself and kind of really getting in touch with. And sometimes we have to look at things we don't want to see, which makes it even harder. So it's a challenge, but it's well worth the payoff that you get at the end.
I agree. Absolutely. I just feel like that relationship you have with yourself, when it is a healthy, connected, empowered relationship, you make decisions that are really in alignment with what's truly best for you versus, this isn't my own quote, it belongs to my mentor, instead of making decisions from the level of our wounds, from the painful place that we carry that we may not even be aware of. It's almost like the pain beneath the pain.
That's right. And that's what I am on a mission to get people to understand, that if we don't deal with it and work through it and spend the time to heal properly, that wound is going to go move into another relationship and then affect us without us even realizing it. And it's kind of outside of our control. It sounds like similar to what you were talking about, the wound kind of guiding us in that way.
Stephanie, what are some of the myths or misperceptions surrounding heartbreak and healing and just this experience in general?
Well, the biggest misperception that I've heard often is the best way to get over someone is to get under someone else. Kind of, we have to move right into another relationship and have someone there. And that always gets a laugh for sure, because it's a funny idea. But in reality, it's sad, because all we're trying to do in that place is not feel any of these hard emotions and to sort of fill a hole quickly with someone else. And that is not going to lead to a healthier relationship and feeling more at peace with whoever you're with.
And are there any other myths or misperceptions?
Well, I think the tendency of us to compare ourselves to others and to think everyone else is somehow in these amazing relationships and have people that love them and we don't, and what's wrong with us? Somehow we're less than others if we're not in a relationship at the moment. So that's a big myth that I think affects a lot of people, because it's hard to imagine, and we don't get a lot of messages in society today that you're fine being single and that that's okay. Most people that are single get, are you dating? Have you met anyone? It's nothing about you as a person. It's all about your dating life. And that can be hard for people that have broke up.
I was just thinking, and when you said that, like we think of the white picket fence, but now I think it's also what I would say is like the Facebook or social media life that we think everyone is having,
Yeah.
And even how just with that, there's this thing where you can put your status. It's interesting how society conspires to being in relationship, what's good and what's normal,
That's right. We get so many hidden messages, we don't even realize it, but it really is the overriding message that we should be in a relationship.
I was looking at something online. I don't even remember what it was now, but someone wrote a blog post and it was called Pictured, Not Pictured. And she was referring to Facebook or, any other social media. And so what she did is she actually put pictures of her life, and they were very happy pictures. And then beneath it, she wrote what was really happening at that time in her life. And pictures were not at all an accurate depiction of what she was going through. And she actually posted, I think at the end of this blog post, a really happy family picture. And then beneath it, she wrote that 2 weeks later, she and her husband decided to divorce. And so just again, showing, I think, what really is the common human experience is it's not just this, glossy, picture perfect, photoshopped existence that society and we believe is what we should be doing and how our life should look like.
Yeah, that's right. And it's so true with the social media. That, I think, is one of the things that makes breakups harder than anything, because it's already easy to idealize everyone else, but social media just kind of serves that to you on a platter. But we're not looking at reality. We're looking at someone's highlight reel.
Yeah, I like that. Stephanie, are there different stages, process of healing from a breakup?
Yes, definitely. It goes along with the grief, healing from grief that we've all heard about here and there, but it has to do with first there being kind of the shock and disbelief, and then of course anger and sadness, and then eventually moving into acceptance. And then I think the final one is kind of being able to reflect back and see the growth that came out of it and what we were able to learn and take away.
Can the grief become more complicated by different aspects to the breakup?
Yes. And I think the most complicated thing about grief is it can bounce all over the place. You can move back and forth between all those stages, and there's no time frame or how long it's going to take. And I think that's the hardest, because sometimes you'll think, oh, I'm finally feeling over this. And then maybe a week or two later, something reminds you of something, and there you feel yourself again at the sadness. And that can be really disconcerting, because it could be like, okay, am I ever going to be past this? So it's just that process that takes time again that can feel really difficult and complicated.
And I can see how some of the things that you described, like, for example, maybe jumping right into another relationship or trying to bury your feelings, maybe staying busy, how these are all different ways of coping with that grief.
Yes, there are ways of coping with it in the short term, unless you were actually really dealing with it and getting what we can from it and learning and growing. It's not going to lead us to having this growth that there could be.
Because you just can't skip the grief process, just even.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really important part, of life, is going through hard times and learning and growing from it.
I can't remember where I heard this, but I know I heard it somewhere. And someone talked about how, we have this normal experience of a life cycle of things beginning and ending in so many ways, in so many places in the human experience, but we really just don't like endings. And so there's this attempt to kind of circumvent that, but yet it's just part of this process of being human.
Yes. And I really love that, because it looks at life much more realistically, that change is constant. Change is a part of life. Things begin and they end, and it's just the way it goes. But you're right. I think we kind of have this idea that we're going to get into one thing and that's going to take us through for the rest of our lives. And that's rarely the case.
Stephanie, do you feel like there's a difference in healing from heartbreak when it's a marriage versus a relationship that is not a marriage?
I think it's really dependent on the relationship itself because, with marriage, there's the added complication of taking care of legal aspects, but all relationships are different and everyone is different. So I think it has more to do with the individual, sort of their level of attachment, their level of connection, their resilience that they have in moving past these things, their ability to kind of look internally and get in touch with themselves versus avoiding it. So I would say it has more to do with the individual person than whatever the status of the actual relationship was.
Stephanie, when you work with clients who are healing from the breakup of a relationship, how do you support them in this process?
Well, I try to just be with them right where they're at because that's so important to have someone that can really walk through the pain and everything you're feeling with you and be compassionate and empathetic. But I'm also pretty challenging because I want to fully support them where they're at, but I want to keep them moving along and pushing them a little bit, challenging them to be looking at things that maybe they don't want to look at or processing different parts of the relationship so that they can really learn what they need to learn from the experience. So it's sort of a combination of gentleness and challengingness.
Yeah, holding them where they're at, but also pushing them and nudging them to grow.
Yes.
When you were talking about the lessons learned in a relationship, it made me think of another interview that I did with a therapist in Newport Beach, California, working with couples and relationships and individuals with relationships. And she said that it's important to learn the lessons in the relationship that ended before moving on to the next relationship, which I think ties into what we were saying again with the wounding and with what you said right now. What is it from this experience that I take with me to help me in the future?
Right, exactly. And I so agree with her because it's true. Just getting into another relationship, all that does is avoid dealing with what is right there on the surface. Kind of like a cozy little blanket, but it wears out eventually.
I just thought of this right now while you were speaking. Do you find when you work with your clients that part of the struggle too is looking at their role in the relationship?
Yes, that is really difficult because oftentimes there's a catalyst for ending the relationship and we can kind of get that, but there's actually dynamics that have led up to this catalyst the whole time. And I feel it's my job to really help the client look at that honestly. And that does mean having to look at your part because I think there's a 50-50 share in what happened in a relationship. It's easier to blame the other person, but that's not going to get the result we want as far as growth. So looking at our own part is so important.
And I think what you said, Stephanie, really ties in beautifully to what you shared at the beginning about this internal process, because I feel that when you are looking at yourself and your roles, you are going within and looking at yourself really deeply.
Yes. And what you get is you get to know yourself so much better. So you have all this new self-awareness that I think equals power because then we have so much more control over our lives and sort of deciding how you want your next relationship to be. If you want a next relationship, what you want your life to look like moving forward. Because it really is a blank slate. You can create whatever you want for your future and where you're going. But it takes some thought and some effort to figure out what exactly that is and to move forward in that direction.
Stephanie, when women are going through this experience, do you have any definite do's or don'ts when they're in this process? Some absolutes, which I know we don't like to talk in absolutes, but for example, one of the things that I tell clients is really try to refrain from making any big decisions right now about, either really solidifying a new relationship that they're involved in, which I try to discourage that at this time. But if they are, to really slow it down. So, is there anything you can add along those lines?
Yeah, I agree with you that it's, hard to have absolutes because it's important to kind of, everyone's so individual and to stay with them right where they are.
Right.
But I think it's at least being willing to understand and openly talk about why you are doing what you're doing or why you want to do what you want to do. So being willing to kind of look at all aspects of that. And it could be really hard because some of that stuff we may not want to see or acknowledge or any of it. But looking at it without judgment, like one absolute I will say I have that all my clients can attest to is I hate the word should.
Okay.
because I think I think that word just carries so much judgment and weight to it that it doesn't help anything. Like I should be in a relationship, or I shouldn't be dating him, or I should, it's more like let's lose the judgment and let's really look at the experience of it. What it's doing for you, how it might not be to your benefit, whatever it is. But the more we can do it in a non-judgmental way, the more honest we can look at it and open we can be.
Stephanie, if we have someone who is listening, who is going through this experience, and perhaps she's either at the beginning, in that crisis emergency room stage, or maybe a little further into it, what would your words of wisdom be for her?
Well, I always say that before I went through this many, many years ago, if I heard of someone being divorced, I'd be like, oh, I'm sorry. And then after I went through it, I was like, okay, no, I'm so sorry you're going through this. I get it. I'm so sorry that you're dealing with this, because it's so hard to understand how painful it is unless you've been through something like this that is such a huge loss. So the first thing I would say with the utmost empathy and compassion is how sorry I am that this is happening and that they're going through it, and that I know it's going to be one of the hardest things they've ever gone through. That also there is such potential if you're willing to do the work and take the time and really be with yourself. There's so much potential to learn more about yourself and to create a life that you maybe never even imagined was possible. And so to hang on to that side of it too, that yes, this is painful and horrible and awful, and we're going to acknowledge that and deal with it. But let's also keep in mind that there's a lot that can happen growth-wise out of this, and not lose sight of that.
Stephanie, do you have any favorite resources that, maybe if one of our listeners is going through this, she can begin to, get some support, get some information to help her through this time?
Yeah, I do. There's a couple of books that I've recommended that I think are pretty good. One of them is called Coming Apart: Why Relationships End and How to Live Through the Ending of Yours. And that's by Daphne Rose Kingman. I think that's a good one. Another one is called The Good Divorce: Keeping Your Family Together When Your Marriage Comes Apart. That's by Constance Aarons. And then another one that we've heard a lot about in the media is called Conscious Uncoupling by Catherine Woodward Thomas. I think each of those books provide some of talk about the empowerment aspect of it that I've been going over. So I think those are helpful. Another book that I'm actually using, if you're in Los Angeles, I run a group for women called Happily Ever After Divorce, Healing Support for Women. It's a support group that meets weekly. And if you're not in Los Angeles, I would recommend looking up a support group, because I think there's something very powerful about working with other women that are experiencing the same thing as you, and sort of having that support and guidance and collaboration around it. A book that I always recommend that's a little different than the previous ones I mentioned is called The Edge of Wonder by Victoria Erickson. It's actually a book of different musings, but I find it really touches upon this part that we can create a new future, and a future that we want, and a future that feels much more resolved. So it's sort of a hopeful book to me that kind of speaks to that.
And what is the best way for listeners to get in touch with you and, learn more about your work and your practice, Stephanie?
My website is pretty easy to remember. It's just therapywithstephanie.com, and Stephanie is Stephanie. So therapywithstephanie.com. I have a blog on there that addresses all kinds of topics related to divorce and moving on and co-parenting and all of that. And then other information that's helpful as well. And they can get in touch with me there.
Stephanie, thank you so much for taking the time today to talk with me and to share all of your wisdom and all this really invaluable information. I know that this is such a difficult time for anyone to navigate, and I am just really glad that you're able to provide this meaningful support for our listeners.
You're so welcome. I'm really happy to be able to reach out and talk to more people about this, because I do think it's so important, and there's so many people suffering when they don't need to be suffering. There's help there and guidance and support and all of that.
And for our listeners, regarding all of the resources that Stephanie shared, along with her contact information, that will all be available in the show notes so that you can go back and find those resources and learn more about Stephanie's work. Stephanie, thanks again so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Take care. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation with Stephanie. What stood out for me is how important a person's relationship with themselves is to the healing process, and that healing from heartbreak involves a shift from what is happening in the person's external world to what is happening within. For show notes to today's episode, visit www.lourdesviato.com/Women in Depth, where you will find notes to today's episode, along with links to the resources mentioned. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe on iTunes and leave a review. Thank you so much for listening, and see you next time.